Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's presentation, Guardians of the Agave, Mexico's pollinator bat, is brought to you by NatHab Expedition Leader Diana Lopez. Diana earned both bachelor's and master's degrees at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, specializing in marine mammals and bioacoustics, and has worked as a marine fauna observer since 2012, collaborating with national and international institutes. Her research and guiding experience spans from studying gray whales and humpback whales in Baja California Sur to following orcas off British Columbia and working as a marine fauna observer off Tampico. Diana combines her academic expertise in marine mammal bioacoustics with over a decade of field experience in ecotourism throughout Mexico and beyond. Diane, it's great to meet you, and thank you for joining us here today. The show is yours. Take it away.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the presentation. Welcome, everyone. I'm very, very happy and excited to be sharing this topic with you, Guardians of the Agave. I think that bats is just one of those themes that everybody is interested in, such as myself. So here we go. And well, as we just listened, I am an expedition leader, and I am guiding in Mexico for the Monarch Butterfly Tour and for the Gray Whale Tour. So I hope to see you there eventually. And well, that is how pretty much working with marine mammals and sound brought my attention to other critters that were emitting sounds as well, such as some birds or some bats. And so that is why I got very interested in making this presentation, especially because of all the conservation issues that it represents in Mexico. So just to give you a little bit of introduction, what we're going to be talking about, what is a bat, what are the ecological importance of it, conservation status, and particularly the Mexican bats. Also, we will be reviewing a little bit about agaves, the bats and agave relationship, the ecological importance, conservation challenges, and emerging solutions. So let's go into the theme. So basically, the term Chiroptera, which is the one that groups all of the bats, refers to the Greek origin of hand wing. And this is incredible because this is the only mammal that actually flies. And it is a very, very wide group. So we're talking about around 1,400 species. And well, it has been along for a long time. And that's why it has imprinted in different cultures. So I wanted just to take into account the cultural significance for Mexico. So Mexico, as along in Mesoamerican mythology, in the Mayan, they associate the bats with the underworld, with the night and the death and sacrifice. And you can see this in the Popol Vuh. So the Popol Vuh is kind of like a community book, and it recreates the history and mythology of local people in Guatemala, and that expanded also throughout the southern portion of Mexico. And they're mentioning there a bat spirit called Camazots. And this bat spirit was at the service of the lords of the underworld. So you could already see it represented in codes in Maya. So this is very impressive, actually. And there's also a lot of sculptures. And if you have a chance to be in the Anthropology Museum in Mexico City, I'm sure you can find plenty of images of it. And also with the agave, which by itself, it references as a plant of life and death. And it is used by millennials in rituals, medicine, and sustenance. So we also see it represented in the code, and it is part of our culture, and it goes way, way back. So the bat agave bond is seen as a symbol of reciprocity because the bats sustain the agave production, and at the same time, the agave is the one nourishing the bats. So what is a bat? So I just mentioned it is a mammal, and it belongs to the order Chiroptera. So now we have two types of main classification for these. but we will go through that in a little bit. So I mentioned that it's the only flying mammal, and it's the second largest order of mammals after rodents. So just imagine that. So 1/5 of the mammals of the planet are bats. So we're talking about around 1,400 species, and they have something very interesting that is being very, very studied about their available, how would you say, the fact that they can cope with virus. So they have a remarkable immune system. And another interesting fact is that just a tiny bat can eat up to 3,000 insects in a night. So just imagine what this represents. We're talking about one single bat. So bats use echolocation to navigate and hunt in the dark. And this is one of the things that draw my attention to the bats, because they are one of the few animals in the in the animal kingdom that can actually use sound to visualize their environments. And well, other characteristics that we have is that we have a wide variety of sizes. So we can find one of the biggest, if not the biggest bat, is a giant golden crowned flying fox. And we're talking about a wingspan around 5 feet long. And this animal can be found in the Philippines. And it's pretty heavy to be a bat. We're talking about 3 pounds. And then you have on the opposite side the bumblebee bat, which is the smallest bat, and there's discussions even about being the smallest mammal in the world, with a size around 1 inch and with a weight of 2 grams. So we have a wide variety. Other things that are very interesting about the bats is their speed. So just in this case, for example, the Mexican free-tailed bat is known to be one of the fastest bats in the world, and we're talking about 99 miles per hour. This is due to their aerodynamic bodies, and because they have longer wings that most of the other bat species don't have, and this allows them also to have a lot of maneuvers. So another interesting fact, now that we're talking about the Mexican three-tailed bat, is that in summer they can gather up in colonies around 50 million individuals in Texas. So just imagine having that view. So the bats, as we know, they have a membrane that goes in between their digits or their fingers, and they have modified their extreme to these type of form. So let me look for the, so in this case, we can see that, very interesting, they have modified their arm in such a way that you can see that here they have their wrist, and from the wrist you have the very elongated digits from which this membrane unites all the way through their arm to their tail, in some cases, and to their lower leg. And this membrane is called patagium, and it allows them to be flying. And we call it an active flight. And this is very different from the birds, in which they have, well, as you know, feathers and the bone structures are very different. The bats have developed a lot of muscles that can support their weights and the movements with these wings. And interesting is that the first fossil of the bat was found 55 million years old, more or less, and they already have this structure. So we had a classification before that was Microchiroptera and Megachiroptera. And we would call it this way because we would group all the small bats worldwide in the Microchiroptera, usually the ones that are more like insects or other type of feeding behaviors. And the Megachiroptera mainly were the ones that are large bats that are feeding by fruit. Okay, so this was like our main classification, but just recently, and very, very recently, we're talking about 2020, 21, that they started questioning this classification. And they are proposing this new classification called Ympterochiroptera and Yanchorochiroptera. So in this case, they're grouping basically all of the bats that are capable of echolocation in Yangochiroptera and that have very developed this system, and the Ympteroptera, which includes some of them, but that have very weak echolocation system developed, and mostly the fruit bats that do not have echolocation system. So that is pretty much the main difference. And what did they use for this classification? It is very interesting that basically they used molecular data that is pretty much nowadays in all studies if you want to do taxonomy, but also they were studying the structure of the ear. So it turns out that the bats have a pretty big cochlea in the case of the ones that do echolocation. And the interesting thing is that they have been studying this throughout all of the fossil records as well to see where did it start. And other thing that they use to differentiate between the yin and the yang bats are the Rosenthal's canal. So it seems like here in this image that we have inside of the cochlea that we have this Rosenthal's canal, and it turns out that when it has a wall less, it has to do with having echolocation abilities. So very interesting to learn that one of the hypotheses that is the strongest one about the evolution of the bats is that basically they started flying before they started echolocating. And they started flying or developing these wings, starting by climbing trees first, and then leaping between trees, then gliding, and then they had a powered flight. So the modern genetic studies now reveal that they possibly diverged 63 million years ago in the Eocene epoch. And this is more or less how we could represent or summarize these two taxonomic groups now. So in general, the bats are pretty much everywhere, as you can see here in the map. We have very, very small areas like islands or the polar regions where we cannot find them, but they have adapted to be pretty much in every ecosystem, and they inhabit in hidden places, as we all know, like in caves and rocks, old buildings, mine, trees, urban areas. And nowadays, we can even sometimes find them in our houses. Now, and a lot of people actually freak out a lot with this. And just a quick comment: do not get scared. The bats are as scared from us as you from them. So the best you can do is just avoid them. And we will be talking about some conservation measurements that you can do at the end of this presentation. So what do they eat? We were talking about this wide variety that we have in bats, and as well on their feeding trends. So we have the bats that are usually feeding on insects. Oh, and very interesting, most of the bats are nocturnal feeders. Then we have the bats that have evolved into eating vertebrates. There's even a species that actually eats frogs. Or we have some fish-eating bats. Actually, here in Mexico, we have one of the species that is endemic to Baja California, and it's actually considered as a marine mammal because it performs most of their livelihood near the water. So other species that we know and that are, like, I think the most accepted by the people are the fruit-eating species because they have this very nice, cute looking face. And then we also have the ones that inspired all of the stories of the vampires, Braham stock. So very interesting fact is that these animals, there are only 3 species of actually vampires, and they're all in Central America, and they only drink just a few milliliters. So it's less than a routine blood test in a clinic, but well, that's how the stories begin. And the interesting thing about these bats is that they have something called reciprocal altruism. So in this case, it means that, for example, if a bat goes out to hunt at night and cannot find food, then it comes back to the shelter or where the colony is, and another bat is going to regurgitate, so it can feed from there and have at least some more hours in order to look for more food. And it doesn't even have to do with if they're related or not. So, and this is something that they have developed as a strategy so they can survive as a species. And well, we also have the species that feed from nectar and pollen. And it can be like causality, the fact that they end up transporting pollen, or they can actively also be feeding on pollen. And the bats that we're going to be talking about today are from this category. So how do they orientate? So actually the bats, as I was mentioning, are one of the few animals capable of doing echolocation. But if you compare it with the marine mammals or odontocets, I have a webinar about that. You might want to go and check it out, but just a quick review. The odontocets, or like the dolphin family, are the ones that do echolocation as well, but they have a different type of echolocation. So they use structures that are called the phonic lips to produce it. And in the case of the bats, they use laryngeal, just like humans. So what is echolocation? Pretty much echolocation is the use of the sound. So they emit it, and this sound bounces back on an object, and they receive that echo, and then they can distinguish the distance or the type of the object or prey, or even the environment. So it's kind of like seeing their environment with the sound. And this is something incredible. And it has evolved only in these small bats, not in the fruit-eating bats. And the first one to actually name it this way was Donald Griffin. And it's basically around 1950s that they actually described this term. And they demonstrated that bats rely on the sound so they can detect their surroundings. So this is just an example of how it would be in the case of a silver-haired bat, their sound of echolocation or sensing their environment. And this is a spectrogram. So a spectrogram is a way to represent the sound, and you can see the frequency of the sound in the time and the intensity with the colors. So this is, let's see. Oh, it doesn't reproduce. Well, I don't know why, because we tested it, but well. Okay, so moving on. How do they orientate? Using these sound frequencies, which are actually very high frequencies. And if you see at this graph, you can see that they are the animals that emit the highest frequencies. We're talking about the lowest 2 kilohertz up to 120 kilohertz. And just for us as a reference, the human has hearing capability that goes between 20 and 20 kilohertz, 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. And we can see it here. And that means that most of the sounds that the bats emit, we can't actually hear them. So this is quite interesting because they have developed this system also to communicate in between them. And this can be also believed to have with acoustic crypsis. This means that their predators actually can't hear them because of the very high frequencies that they're emitting. And also it is believed that it has to do a lot with the type of food strategy that they have adopted, right? Because in the case of the bats that rely on fruits, they actually need to rely a lot on vision. And usually they are hunting or feeding in crepuscular hours. And in the contrary case with the animals that are very nocturnal and that they depend on the feeding of insects or small vertebrates, they need to have all the possible information that maybe that because of the dim of the light they cannot obtain. But here's the interesting thing. There's actually a saying, blind as a bat, but are they really blind? And it turns out that no, actually all of the bats are able to see. And not only that, they actually see in very good in low light conditions. And in the case of the fruit bats, they can even perceive the ultraviolet light. This is very impressive. And in the case of the insectivorous bats, they actually have made experiments in which they show the bats how to recognize the objects that they have, and then they turn on the lights and they play very loud noise. So in this case, the bats cannot use echolocation, and still the bats are able to recognize this figure. So this was a very interesting experiment to show that they rely also on seeing. So they have also developed very interesting behavioral adaptations, like very social behavior. So we've just mentioned that in the case of the Mexican free-tailed bat, they have up to millions of individuals in colonies. Another interesting thing is that they have something that is called roosting. That is when they're pretty much hanging upside down. And people usually ask themselves, why are they hanging upside down? Why do they need to be doing that? Well, it turns out because of their anatomy or their structure, it's easier for them to just raise in flight when they're roosting, just to drop by and glide, than if they do it trying from the floor. And this would also make them more vulnerable to the predators. They also, some of them have developed not only migration, but hibernation strategies in which they lower their metabolism a lot in order to wait for the food to be available again. And we already mentioned communication and speed. Okay, so as I was saying, some of the species actually migrate, some of them don't, and this usually happens when the food is very scarce. So this makes them set in flight and start their migration. And in this case, we call it's a follow the flowers migration pattern, in which pretty much the bats are just looking to be feeding or all these plants that can give them nectar to continue. And some of them can even migrate 1,000 miles in pursuit of nectar. So in this case, in this map, we are looking at the two different species of bats that are the main pollinators here in Mexico, the lesser long-nosed bat and the greater long-nosed bat. And we can see how much they're moving from central Mexico up to the north. So another interesting thing about the bats is that they actually have a gestation of 6 to 9 weeks, usually is one pup. But then we have an exception. We have the eastern red bat that can actually give birth to twins. And they usually breed between spring and midsummer. And the females make the nests. So after 1 month, then the pups can start flying out and roosting. Unfortunately, we also know that we have some predators for these species, and most of them are the owls and the hawks. But another one that is hitting very strong in all of these population of bats is the white nose syndrome, that is actually a fungus. And well, the oldest bat registered was 41 years old. So usually we think that the small animals have a very short lifespan because they have very high metabolism, but the bats are like the exception to this rule, actually. So I just mentioned 41 years old. It can vary, it depends on which species we're talking about, but this is quite interesting. So what is the importance of the bats? Pretty much, I was mentioning one single bat can eat 3,000 insects. So just imagine what they represent as for the farmers, reducing all these crop damage from insects. And then we also know that they're very strong pollinators. So they are the ones in charge of moving the pollen from one plant to the other. And over 300 species of fruit depends on bats for pollination. So just imagine that. And also, well, we know that they're seed dispersers, so they play a vital role in regeneration of the forest or environment, and they scatter seeds across this area. So they actually can spread out the seeds of plants that are like the pioneers in reforestation. So unfortunately, their conservation status for some of them is not looking very good. This is just an image that I was able to find from 2012, but it gives you an idea of how critical it can be for some species. So now let's talk a little bit of the agave. Okay, so what is an agave? And this is something that goes all around the country, pretty much from the central to the north. It is actually a plant that belongs to this family Asparagaceae, and it is native to arid regions of Mexico, the United States, and Central America. There's over 200 different species, and they belong to these species that are called succulents and xerophytes. So xerophyte means all of these species that have adaptations to live in environments that have very little water. And in the case of the agave, that's why they have these succulent leaves. And well, they usually grow in this form that are like rosettes, and they usually have tiny spines and a very prickly point in the end. They are perennial, so this means that it takes many, many years for one plant to mature and to flower. And in this case, 90% of the agaves are monocarpic. This means that after so many years of growing, and when they're ready, they flower, and once they flower, they die. So it's interesting to learn that some species can reach up to 25 years to mature. So just look at this image, just for you to have an idea of how long sometimes the stems can get, up to 50 feet tall. So this is an aerial view. So as we know, this tall stem or mast, we know it in Spanish as quiote. Okay, so the question, how do agave reproduce? So this is where the bats are so important for these species. So the sexual reproduction in this case is, we mentioned that they're monocarpic. So this means that they flower once they mature, and once they flower, they can have hundreds of little flowers on this stem, and that's what attracts to all of these pollinators from the region. Between them, they're the bats, and after the pollinizations, the agave produces seeds that then disperse and germinate. But then we have another option for these. We have an asexual reproduction or a clonal propagation. And this is quite interesting because they have two options. They can have offsets or pups that pretty much are clones that grow around the main plant, like in this case, and they have all the same genetic information. That's why they're clones, and they grow from the root system. But then we also have these bulbils that grow in the stem in the case of the flowers not being pollinized. So this is like the backup plan of these plants for them to colonize in these areas because of the very, very harsh landscape that we have. So the problem about these two, the asexual reproduction, is that we have very low genetic diversity, and this can bring a lot of problems. We will be talking about that in a few moments. Okay, so now let's talk about the importance of the agave in the Mesoamerican civilization. So it has been in our culture for at least 9,000 years. Imagine that. We already saw that they're even in the Mayan codes. And they have been used for a lot of things. Most of them were used for ropes, textiles, and paper, as we can see in this image right here. And this is very interesting because the plastic, before it just pretty much took over everything here in the world. In Mexico, we used to use a lot of fibers that were made out of agaves, and we actually even exported them. Also for the construction and rituals, and this is something lovely because when we're driving towards the sanctuary of the monarch butterfly, we can see the houses that have all the fencing systems with the agaves, and it is very distinguished, and it's something very nice to see. And well, as we all know, as food and drink. So there's pretty much 4 main beverages that come out from the fermentation and distillation of the agave. And we have the pulque, which is part of like a beverage of ancient rituals. And we have mezcal and tequila, which are distillations, and bacanora. The interesting thing is that all of these are mezcals, but the tequila has to do with a very specific agave type. So the indigenous knowledge systems have shaped agave cultivation and use for centuries. And this is just one idea that we can have of all of these species, which ones are the ones used for mezcales, which ones are used for tequila, well, in this case, which one is used for tequila, and the ones that are used for pulque. So if you ever come by to Mexico, a lot of people don't like it, but I think you have to try the things that are local, and pulque is something very popular, and they call them curados when it's natural, just a fermented agave, but then they can put in some fruit to make it like with flavor. So then you have the strawberry ones, or you have even the cucumber ones. So it's very interesting to try. And well, here, this we can see, this is a harvester. We call it in Spanish jimador. So basically what they're trying to do is that they extract the core or the heart of the agave, which we call piña, as in pineapple, because it contains all of the sugars from which they're going to be processing and producing these beverages. And he uses a hoe or a coa to extract this heart. So this is just an example of a typical plantation of blue agave, and this is specifically for tequila. So for you to have an idea, we can have between 1,000 and 2,000 agaves per acre can produce more or less 2,000 gallons of tequila. So here in this table, you can see more or less what are the products: pulque, mezcal, tequila, and bacanora. What is the type? This one is fermented beverage, and this one is, these are distilled. And what are the agave source? So interesting to learn also that the content of alcohol can be very different depending on the product and the flavor profile as well. And here I want to highlight the bacanora because this is a regional tradition from Sonora, which is a state in the northwest from Mexico, and it has to be produced there in order to be called bacanora. So one of the problems is that because of the high demand of these products is that these species is facing something that is called monoculture, in which they're actually losing a lot of habitat, the wild ones or the natural ones, in order to have the ones that are cultivated, and also the over harvesting. So this is becoming an issue, and it is worrying a lot because of the bats. So just for you to have an idea, again, in 2022, 2 billion tons of blue agaves were harvested to make 170 million gallons of tequila. And they're not staying here in Mexico. Actually, most of them are being exported. Tequila has become very popular worldwide, and mezcal is following the tequila path. So I really like this image. This is, I recommend it highly, from the National Geographic magazine. They did an infographic, and it's lovely to see. I took some images from it because I think it's worth showing it to you, but I love how it starts. A bat and an agave walk into a bar. Okay, So we know that this relationship between bats and agave goes on for millennia, but they have been exposed to certain ecological problems due to these overharvesting of the agave. So in general, we can summarize the situation as this. Agave depends on nectar-feeding bats for successful pollination. Remember that we have the sexual and the asexual reproduction. So for the sexual one, we rely on bats 100%, and the nocturnal blooms are the ones that are releasing this nectar in order to attract all of the bats for them to forage. And as they come and feed, then a little bit of pollen gets stuck in their, I don't know, in their snout, and then they transport it to another plant. And that is how we can have more diverse genetics in this case. So we call it a cross-pollination because it is between two different individuals of plants. And this helps the plant to develop genetic diversity. So it allows it to have better genes in the case of having climate stress or some very strong environmental change, so it can respond to it. So in the case of the bats, we know that here in Mexico, we have up to 138 different species of bats, but we have three main ones that are the primary pollinators of the agaves, and these are the Mexican long-nosed bat, the lesser long-nosed bat, and the Mexican long-tongued bat. And this is very interesting to see. I just want to highlight how is their rostrum very different from the ones that actually hunt on insects. So just a brief commercial. The ones that actually feed on insects have very elaborate structures in their face, so they can catch all of the echoes that are bouncing back from echolocation, and they have very accurate sensing of where is their prey. And in the case of these, which are nectar feeders, they have a very different structure of their face. It's not as cute as the ones that feed on fruits, but I think they're very nice to see. And well, here we have our nectar corridor. So these three bats basically migrate throughout this nectar corridor, and they have different timings. So pretty much the bats must visit hundreds of flowers every night along the corridor, and it happens when they start losing their food, they have to migrate. So in this case, every spring, especially the pregnant females fly north when agaves bloom, and this is quite interesting because it's the pregnant females. And then in fall, they come back with their youngs to the southern region of Mexico as soon as the agave starts blooming again. So here we have the three species, and what I really like to learn is that the lesser long-nosed bat actually has huge colonies, around 10,000 individuals. That is so much. And if you compare it with the Mexican long-tongued bats, they have shorter colonies, between 10 and 15 individuals, or in the case of the Mexican long-nosed bat, up to 1,000 individuals. So that's why it's easier to follow up and study the lesser long-nosed bat. And they actually migrate in different timings, well, slightly different. So the lesser long-nosed bat migrates between February and March, that it goes to the north, and then it comes back through July and August. And in the case of the Mexican long-nosed bat, it is a little bit further, between May and September. And what is interesting is that in the case of the Mexican long-nosed bat, is that it is actually also hard to follow because they are locally migrating and seasonally too. So I really like this image. I hope you can look this up. Here is a link, the nationalgeographic.com magazine, and its graphics. And this issue in 2023, it received an award of excellence from the Society for News Designs. So I really enjoyed finding this and learning from it. So the stalk has thousands of nectar-rich flowers that release pollen at night. And the agaves actually produce up to 60 times more nectar than other pollinating plants. So the bats, as I was mentioning, have these structure muzzle, and that it helps them to reach the nectar of these flowers, and the muzzle gets all of the pollen in their when they're in contact with the flower. So then we call it cross-pollination when this flies to another agave and it transfers the pollen to the stigma of a new flower. And this this tends to have the sexual reproduction and the seed formation. So this is pretty much summarized how it works. But what is the problem? That now that we have monocultures, the ones that are cultivating, or los jimadores, they actually have to cut the stem, because that way the plant can continue to grow and to store all of the sugars that were going to be for the stem and the flowers. They store the sugars inside of the heart of the plant, or the piña, the pineapple. That is the one that they're using for the mezcal and for tequila and pulque. So this means that we have huge extensions of monocultives of agaves that do not have flowers, and then we have a lot of bats that are looking for these flowers and that are deprived from the food. So what is the problem? That they're basically being declined in the pollinators. There's being a uniformity of the genetic flow among these because they're all clones. And this represents also a gene flow disruption with also other types of agaves that are wild agaves. So why does this all matter? What happens if all of them are clones? Well, this is a huge problem because we're talking about the clones not having the availability to respond to a change in the environment. So if you all have the same genes, you're going to respond the same way. And probably if there's a catastrophe out there, if you have a susceptibility in that genome, then you won't be able to respond. So that's why it's very important for them to increase their genetic diversity. Also, to support the pollinators, not only the bats, but we already mentioned that there's other pollinators involved, and they maintain ecosystem services. So they actually can help in the landscapes, as in soil stabilization and carbon sequestration, and also the cultural and economic sustainability. This is very important because of all these historic and traditional agave uses and the gene flowing connectivity. So if we don't have pollen moving among the wild and the cultivated populations, there's going to be a limit between the flow of the genes. And it is very important to keep this genetic corridor open. So pretty much we can summarize it in this. Bats ensure reproductive success of agaves, especially in fragmented or anthropocized landscapes where other pollinators are scarce. And agaves serve as critical food sources during bat migrations throughout this nectar corridor up to the United States. And something that I found that I really like to share with you is that recent research showed that if you compare the bats and the birds, actually the bats carry more pollen than the birds and they move it further out, so up to 600 meters. So this shows you how important are the bats or pollinator bats for the population to thrive. So if we don't have this pollen transfer between these cultivated and wild agaves, this is showing us that there's a fragmentation between the gene flow. So what is being done? I found this group called the Bat Conservation International. I invite you to look at their webpage. It's amazing all the effort they're doing. And it's not only about science, sharing science with the local people, but also planting agaves and trying to help the communities to thrive in other manners that cannot affect that much in this case are trying to have production of monocultures, but leaving some of them with stems so they can flower, and then the bats can be able to feed and to pollinize. So this is like a bat-friendly measurement that is being implemented in all of these regions, and also to reinforce them to gain other training for sustainable jobs. And this is just some examples, and of course, planting is very, very important. So what can you make for a difference for the bats? What can you do? So this is very nice because one would think, oh, well, I can't really do much. The people that do conservation are the ones in charge. But no, you can actually put your little seed and try to help in nating these species. And one is very important to share the information. The public education is very, very important, that all of these myths that we have about the bats, the vampire bats that want to attack us, well, it's really not true. They're as scared as we are from them, and just trying to avoid touching them or getting close to them because of all the sonorities that they could actually be contagious. But if you don't have a direct contact with them, it should be okay. Like if they're outside in your garden, there's no need for you to call somebody to take them down or to relocate them. They're just trying to find a spot where they can thrive. So actually you can help by stop using pesticides in your garden. In Bat Conservation International, there's even a guide, as well as in this Bat Conservation Trust, where you know what type of plants you can plant in your garden for them to just like helping in the corridor, in the nectar corridor. Remember that they're migrating. There's actually something called bat houses, which I didn't know about. So it's trying to help them because there has been so much deforestation activity nowadays. And also there's now this logo called Bat Friendly Tequila. So if you love tequila and you want a good margarita, just go for the bottle that actually has this logo. So this is the Bat Friendly Tequila, and it's an organization that approves that these cultivated agaves are actually leaving some of the stems for the bats to feed. So another thing that just recently found out, and one of my dear friends and co-guides, Melissa Silva, which is a star in the webinar, she shared this with me, and I wanted to share it with you, that this webpage is a Latin American network for the conservation of the bats. So they have the option of this website in English, and they have this book that you can download that is the sites and areas of importance for conserving the bats in Latin America, if you're more curious, and in the Caribe. And other sources that you can check out besides this Bat Conservation International are some videos. This one I really like because Professor Yossi Jovel has a lab where he focuses on everything that has to do with neuroecology of the bats, and he just published this book, The Genius Bat, which is already in my bucket list for reading. There's also some this is the logo I was mentioning about the bat friendly org. You can go online and also check how are they managing all of this. There's a bats amp where you can see. This is a portal for acoustic monitoring of the bats, and you can actually hear them and see the spectrograms as I was showing, the one that didn't work, but you can go online and check here. And on Spotify, I have found very interesting also podcasts. So thank you everyone for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed it.
All right, Diana, thank you so much. Before we dive into the questions, though, I would like to remind everyone that if you do have a question, you can submit them via the question field in your control panel. Just go to that upper right-hand corner, click on the 3 lines, and go on down to where you see questions. Click on that field and put your question right in there. So let me ask you this. Do hummingbirds ever utilize the agave nectar?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't think the agaves are exclusive for just bats. I think that any pollinator that has the ability of sucking the nectar will be around there. But I can't tell you 100% how much is that hummingbirds actually use agave. But I do not think it is only for bats, definitely.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. So, is there a difference between nectar eating bats and fruit eating bats?
Oh yeah, for sure. No, definitely. The nectar feeding bats literally have developed all of their structures, even the face form that I was mentioning, everything in order for them to suck the nectar out of the flower. And in the case of the fruit bats, they even have a difference in the scheduling of when they're actually feeding. Like I mentioned that some of them are crepuscular. This means that they can be at dawn and dusk already foraging or looking for food. And the other very interesting thing is that the fruit bats have developed, as you can see, they have huge eyes. So this tells you that anatomically and physiologically, they are very different because they have specialized into what they're feeding from.
Very interesting. Thanks. So, what happens if there isn't fruit or nectar for them to feed off of? Is there an alternate source of food for them?
No, these are specifically nectar feeding bats. That's why it's the whole problem, you know, like if we don't have enough nectar to feed them, they're going to start starving. And these are animals that, as any other living animal, that needs to have a constant supply of their food. But these one in particular, because of the amount of food that they need because of their energetic demands of flying, well, this is quite an issue.
Indeed, definitely. Um, so, have there been any studies done, or do we know any much about their sense of smell?
That's a good question. To be honest, I didn't read anything about the smell of the bats, but I'm definitely going to check that one out and hopefully come back to you, or you can send me an email and then I'll have the answer by then. But that's a good question.
Yeah, absolutely. So, how important is the agave plant to the economy in Mexico?
Well, as I was mentioning, the agave is not only used for the beverages, but it's also used for many other stuff. And actually, part of the program that Bat Conservation International is trying to reinforce is that they use the fibers also for the livestock. So it's not about only the beverages, but it's kind of like a pretty sustainable income for Mexicans because also it guarantees you that there's going to be people consuming the beverage, but also because of this resilience that they show growing in these environments in which you really don't need to take that much care. The thing is that you need to invest in time because, as I was mentioning, for one of the species, it can take up to 25 years to mature. So, usually, when they're harvesting, it's after a certain period of years, but it is very economically reliable for the communities that actually use this for an income. And the fact that the tequila, well, I don't know if you know this, but the tequila is from a town called Tequila where you find this type of agave, and that's why it's so specific and correlated. So the town per se subsists only on the tequila and even tourism for tequila, and they take you around to see all of the lands full of these monocultures, and it's quite interesting.
Well, that's fascinating. Not something I'd ever thought about before.
Yeah.
So, we showed in the picture titled "What is a bat?" We had a question about why is the one joint in the bat's right wing called a thumb, and the same joint on its left wing is called a wrist. Did I misunderstand that?
Oh, yeah. Let me go back. But what I wanted to show you, or what I was trying to highlight, is that the fact that they have, oh, well, it's going to take a little while, but the fact that they have this wrist that can literally hold on to all of the 4 digits that are the ones that have the membrane going in between, and the thumb is the one that is not connected to this to the wing system with the membrane. So that is quite well. I found it very unusual that just because of this articulation, the wrist, it's holding the whole structure. You know, like I think it's unbelievable. But that's what I was trying to highlight.
Gotcha. No, thank you for clarifying that. That really helps. Um,
Sorry.
no, you're totally fine. So let me ask you, how many litters will the average female have?
Oh, so she usually just has one litters? Do you mean how many times does she have a
Well,
pup?
I believe that's the question. Is it, if you could maybe help clarify
So that's
that for us, that'd
a
be
good
helpful.
question. So they usually have, I believe that they have a pup yearly. And I mentioned that it depends on the species, how long it can, like, what is their lifespan. So at least I would imagine that at least 5 to 10 pups, but I'm not really sure. I'm just thinking about if they migrate to have their pups and they do this yearly, and then you can imagine the lifespan average around 10 years for the species, and I guess it's more or less like this. I'm not quite sure, but yeah.
A fascinating question. So we've had a guest pop on and wanted to ask you specifically if you have had a close encounter with a bat.
That's a great question. So last year, I don't know, was it this year? We went to the Monarch Butterfly Sanctuary, and part of the tour is also visiting a very special place in the area that is not with the monarchs, but is part of like the coming back to Mexico City. And this is a gorgeous spot. I love it. It is in the Sierra or the mountain range, and but it's a little bit warmer weather. And we were actually with the people, we were doing an excursion, looking out of all the plants they have and the river, and it's amazing. And then suddenly one of my guests ran around in one of the caves. I was like, no, don't get in there. And then she was like, no, you have to come here. And we popped in there, and there was several bats hanging in the cave, and it was a spectacular moment. But then you try to think like, oh, we're invading their refuge, so we need to be quiet, and more considering that they're so sensitive in their sound frames, you know. So that was one of the highlights of my trip. I know it's focused for monarch butterflies, but that was like a first for me. So I am very, very excited. And also, I just attended the Bioacoustics conference, and I actually won a microphone for recording bats and birds. So I'll let you know all about my findings for my next webinar, hopefully.
Sounds terrific, Diana. Thank you for sharing that with us. Unfortunately, that is going to be the last question that we do have time for today. So I'd like to throw it back to you for some closing comments.
Well, just to remind you that everyone can put a little effort to try to preserve all of these amazing species that have co-evolved in time, and that maybe we only have them for a few weeks in our areas, or maybe they don't even pop out in our backyards. But just knowing that they're out there and that we can try and do more for preserving them and helping them out, I think it's worth it. And don't forget to spread the word, because it's so important that the new generations are aware of all of this.
Diana, thank you so much. This was a terrific webinar. You made a lot of people happy out there today. So thank you for that.
I'm very happy. Thank you, you too. And thank you everyone for attending.
And I'd also like to thank everyone who attended with us today. So if you are interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, please give us a call at 800-543-8917, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com. TIMECODES.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on the website soon. With that, I will conclude today's webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We shall see you next time.
Bye.